In the year 1415, the Roman Catholic Church condemned a man that had already been dead for over 30 years. You see, in 1415, it was also the year of the Council of Constance in what is present day Germany, and it was called together to deal with a really big problem. You see, 30 years earlier, two rival popes had been elected at the same time. You had Gregory the 12th in Rome and Benedict the 13th in Avignon, in France, each with their factions of supporters. In 1409, there was a Council of Pisa that was called to resolve the issue, and they elected a new pope, Alexander V. But all this did was just add a third pope. The Council of Constance was called to clean up this mess. So they first declared themselves superior to all popes, got rid of them, and then elected a new pope, Martin V. Now, there was another, less headline-grabbing issue on the council's agenda that year, and that was to deal with the teachings of one John Wycliffe, who had already passed away 31 years earlier. But his ideas just wouldn't go away. You see, his followers were called the Lollards, and Wycliffe had objected to a number of Catholic teachings because they were man-made and not found in Scripture, which he believed should be the final authority for doctrine and practice. This led him to a conviction that the Bible should be available to everyone, including common Englishmen. And he argued, he said this, Englishmen learn Christ's law best in English. Moses heard God's law in his own tongue, so did Christ's apostles. John Wycliffe died in 1384, but his teachings did not. In 1415, this Council of Constance officially condemned Wycliffe as a heretic on 260 counts, excommunicating him, banning his writings, and hunting down his followers. Anyone caught reading a copy of a Bible in the common language was either heavily fined or, as persecution unfortunately continued to increase, some were burned at the stake. They would even hang their Wycliffe Bible around their neck when doing so. But this was a crack in the monopoly. Word was getting out. People could read the Bible for themselves. And this meant that even the council's declaration about Wycliffe was ignored. So, not satisfied, 14 years later, 1428, the church had his bones exhumed, burned, and then the ashes scattered into a nearby river. But Wycliffe's work endured. 100 years later, in 1522, William Tyndale, who was influenced by Wycliffe and other reformers, he was convinced that the way to God was through his word. And the problem was that the Bible was still really only widely available in Latin, which was a language that the vast majority of people could not read. Wycliffe had used the Latin Vulgate as a source to translate the Bible into English, but for accuracy, Tyndale wanted to go to the original languages, Greek and Hebrew. Both the established Roman Catholic Church and the newly formed Anglican Church, headed by the King of England, still taught they alone could keep and interpret God's word, that regular people have no business reading the Bible for themselves. But even though he was forced to live on the run, Tyndale famously said, I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life very many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plow to know more of the Scriptures than you. Tyndale succeeded in translating and then printing thousands of copies of the Bible. He used the new Gutenberg's movable type press. It wasn't invented in Wycliffe's day. Many of those copies were then smuggled back into England. Though any who were found by the Church of England, those were burned. In 1535, however, Tyndale was betrayed by a friend. He was imprisoned for over a year and a half for the crime of producing a Bible in the common language. On October 6th, 1536, he was led outside to a stake where he was strangled and burned alive. His last words were a prayer. To make the English Bible legal, he said, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. 2 years later, King Henry VIII ordered that copies of the Bible be placed in all churches in his realm, and those copies were to be written in English. When the translators of the King James Version produced their Bible in 1611, they relied on Tyndale's work. About 90% of the KJV version is from Tyndale's translation. I think it's safe to say that we don't always appreciate the work and what it took to get the Bible into our own native language. I'm Pastor Andy, Pastor Drewski on my live streams, and recently we've had a number of discussions on my gaming channel on Twitch on a fairly common topic. It just keeps coming up. We talk about versions of the Bible and which to use. Now, the question seems obvious. Shouldn't all Christians just agree on one Bible? Why do we keep making more? Right? Doesn't just make this worse. The simplest answer is that we do have one Bible, but we don't all speak Greek and Hebrew. So unless you want to learn Greek, you're going to need a translation. So why don't we all agree on one translation? Well, there's a number of reasons to that too. Not the least of which is because not everyone actually speaks English. Let's not forget there are more languages out there. Now, when the books of the Bible were first written, they were written in the common language of the people of their day. The Bible was meant to be understood. Now, we have a tendency to become loyal to certain versions, like the Latin Vulgate during Wycliffe's and Tyndale's time, or the King James Version perhaps today. These are still translations, though, from the original language. They're not original themselves, and even though much care was given to be accurate in that work of translation, only the originals are inspired by God. So why not make our translations of them be as understandable as we can to the reader? Well, at a minimum, what is considered understandable keeps changing. Even if we just talk about today and the various English versions, think about it. Over time, the English language has changed, and that change is accelerating. Linguists say that the English language has changed more in the last 400 years than the Greek language in 2000. The spelling, grammar, syntax, everything about English is different. If you were to pick up an original 1611 King James Bible, and even if you were raised on reading the King James Bible of today, the 1611 version would give you pause. I've got an example of one of the most well-known verses in the world, John 3:16. That I'll put right here. It is familiar enough because most of us already have the verse memorized. But if you were to take that familiarity away, you'd probably struggle through each word. You'd get to the end, but it's not easy. Now, I mentioned the original books of the Bible were written in Greek and Hebrew. There's actually some Aramaic as well. And we have a large number of manuscripts, which are handwritten copies that we found in archaeology, in those languages that we use to translate from. The goal, of course, is to be as accurate as possible to the original writing, meaning that the oldest manuscripts we have, the ones that are closest to the originals, those are the ones that get the most authority in translation work. We use those to make our modern Bible versions. This creates some interesting situations, though, because when the King James was written, and the various versions that are now based off of it, they didn't have all the same manuscripts we have today. We have found older manuscripts than they had access to. So, why don't we update those? Well, there's a certain level of loyalty and tradition with updating it, and it probably would be opposed. But I do want to have eventually a video on those manuscripts and how can we know that those manuscripts are reliable, that they're accurate, and that we can be confident that what we have is in fact the Word of God as it was written. But why do we have all these different translations? Well, we know that we need to translate into more languages than just English. But even within English, not everyone can read at the same proficiency, right? Different translations can help with that. King James is written at about a 12th grade reading level. The New American Standard Bible, the NASB, that's about a 11th grade. But other translations like the New Living Translation, NLT, that's closer to 6th grade, meaning more people can read with ease and understanding. Now, different translations also serve different purposes. Some months ago, I shared a story on my live stream. It's a rather dull saga about getting a new printer. It's just kind of a dry story of mild frustration that I had over a number of weeks with multiple products that failed for one reason or another. And before it all started, if you had asked me about a brand to recommend for a printer, I might have said one thing. After that whole series of events, I would probably give you a different brand as a recommendation. Now, usually the brands don't really matter since they all should be able to print fine. But when you need to ask, what is it you're needing to do? Now you need to start looking into comparing and contrasting and specialization. Some brands will do different things from other brands to stand apart. Therefore, if you recognize what your needs are, you can find out your best fit. You can use the same example with cars or tools or sports teams. They all have the same baseline of expectation of what they're supposed to be able to do, usually. But at the same time, they're going to specialize. They're going to have things that they do better than the other ones in their same category to stand apart. Translations have specialties. They stand apart. They have different things that they're good at. So there's often multiple options when you translate a particular word. Which methodology should you use to bring that Greek or Hebrew word into English so that you have the right one for a given passage? Those methodologies, they're really boiled down to two. We've got two different approaches that generally are used, and all of our different translations fall on a spectrum of those two different methodologies. The spectrum goes between what's called formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. We might say a formal equivalence is word-for-word translation, whereas dynamic would be more of thought for thought. Let me explain. A word-for-word translation strives to render the original text as literally as possible, even at the expense of readability. It's looking for accuracy. Some examples of versions that use this would be the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the Revised Standard Version, and the King James Version. These can be reliably used for deep study. A pastor might preach about a specific word in a given passage, and the whole passage revolves around the meaning of that one word. Well, the pastor better be sure that that word is, in fact, in the original scriptures. A small group study, they might find themselves digging deeper into a verse because somebody asked, why did God choose to word it that way? The downside here is sometimes cultural language can be translated accurately, but the meaning it's supposed to be conveyed might elude us. Consider idioms, right? An idiom is something that communicates an idea with imagery or cultural context, but not necessarily using the actual definitions of the words involved. So it's the elephant in the room. In a nutshell, I could be under the weather, on a wild goose chase, have cold feet while I walk on eggshells. I could give you a cold shoulder, even though I'm on thin ice and burning bridges. That's a pain in the neck, but at least it's only once in a blue moon. And it's as easy as pie. Now, I've also learned a few that apparently, though I don't understand them, in German, I can have tomatoes on my eyes if I'm not seeing something everyone else can see. In Swedish, if there's no cow on the ice, that means you don't have to worry. And apparently in Japanese, to wear a cat on one's head means pretending to be a nice person. I don't even know if I got these right. Maybe in the comments you guys can give me some better ones or at least explain what I'm trying to get across here. But the Bible has these too. When the Israelites came to the Promised Land, what did they call that land? They said it was a land flowing with milk and honey, to describe just how rich and fertile that land was. And of course, today, if they're needing to prepare for action, or then when they're prepared for action, they might have to gird up their loins. Get ready to do something and take action. Be ready to run. Now, we might accurately translate these. We might have the exact words involved. But sometimes the word-for-word translations will leave us scratching our head as to what exactly is it trying to say here. Now, on the flip side, a thought-for-thought translation, the dynamic equivalent, they emphasize the idea being communicated and readability. The structure of the sentence, it might be rearranged so that it can flow better. The words may be swapped out if it's no longer used that way within our cultural context. If it's done right, poetry and songs should read and flow as naturally as they would have in the original language. The goal remains to be faithful to the meaning of the text, though not confined to necessarily the original words to do so. And I've got some examples of thought-for-thought translations as well. The New Living Translation, NLT, or the Contemporary English Version, and the Good News Translation are all thought-for-thought translations of the Bible. Now, I think it's really important to clarify that different translations do not mean different Bibles. Translations are tasked with a very difficult job of finding the best equivalent English word for a given Hebrew or Greek. Let me give you an example. The Hebrew word nehar. In Joshua 24:23, it's describing the Canaanite idols that the people of Israel had begun to adopt and worship. Some options for nehar would be foreign, or strange, or alien, or false, to describe them as gods. Or they could just say idols. The basic meaning doesn't actually change. They're still false gods. King James uses strange, New American Standard says foreign, and New Living just says idols. They're all faithful translations to the Bible, and they strive to preserve the meaning of the passage. The conversation then is about whether word for word or thought for thought. It really just boils down to which language will receive deference, the original or the language of today's reader. Now, there is a few translations that strive for a middle of the road, okay, a happy medium. The most well-known of those would probably be the New International Version, the NIV, very popular version. And for the most part, it does succeed at that goal. But for reasons I'm honestly not going to go into, for it's outside the scope of our talk today, I really can't recommend any of the new versions, the updated versions after the 1984 edition. And if you were to go and buy a new NIV, it will be one of those new updated versions. Also, I would caution against versions that are not translations at all, but are rather paraphrases, like the Message and the Living Bible, or my favorite, and I have one here, the Word on the Street. These are paraphrases. They try to rephrase something in your own words, and they might be useful. It can help you understand, maybe as an introduction to the Bible. It's easy reading for sure, but they shouldn't be used as your primary Bible, since there's no actual translating from the original at all. That leaves the door open to error. My point is, real translations each have their own strengths. And if we recognize that, we can use them accordingly and benefit from both. For example, in Matthew 18, Jesus tells a parable, a story about a king who forgave his servant a great amount of money that was owed. It was actually 10,000 talents. But that servant went on and did not extend the same grace to a fellow servant who owed him a smaller amount, 100 denarii. Now, the words of verse 28, talking about when the one servant would not forgive the second, they're literally translated into English as this: went out, but slave that, and found one fellow slaves of his, who owed him 100 denarii, and he seized him, and to choke, saying, pay back what you owe. Now, you might be able to work through it, but obviously this is difficult to read. A word-for-word translation does manage to be more readable, and you can note the similarities to their literal words. Here's that same verse in the New American Standard, the NASB. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves, who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him and began to choke him, saying, "Pay back what you owe." This is certainly more readable. Though we might still be wondering, what is a denarii? And of course, earlier in the passage with the king and the forgiveness, what is a talent, much less 10,000 of them? We might have other questions too, because literal accuracy is the goal. Anytime it needs to add a word for clarity's sake, the translators let you know they've done so by either putting the added word in brackets or italics. In this case, the words began and the second time it says him are added into that text. But they let you know so you can know confidently what is present in the original. Now, a thought-for-thought translation can clean up the phrasing even more, as well as update the monetary amount into something we're more familiar with and can relate to, right? The New Living Translations puts this passage like this. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. Now, for context, the New Living Translation described earlier the 10,000 talents that were owed as millions of dollars. So, the thought for thought has a clear advantage here, right? It's more readable. But there are downsides too. For example, note in this passage, the New Living Translation states that the fellow servant that owed him a few $1,000s and was forgiven a few million by the king. If you also keep in mind the Message, which is one of the popular paraphrased versions, that one says that the fellow servant owed him $10 and the servant owed the king 100,000. Both of these do give the idea of a large amount of money being owed and forgiven, and then a relatively smaller amount being owed and not forgiven. However, by putting that dollar amount, the value can change. Depending on factors like inflation, the intended message might actually be lost. $10 used to mean a lot of money. Now it won't get you a fast food meal. And we might be saying the same thing about thousands of dollars in a few years. The NASB translators, on the other hand, using word for word, left in that 100 denarii, rather than giving a modern equivalent. And in the passage with the king, they again kept the words for 10,000 talents. That's not very convenient to the reader at first, but by preserving the original word, the reader might investigate. What is a denarii and a talent? How much are they worth? And then we discover that a denarii is a day's wage, however much that might be in modern equivalent. Then we find out that 100 days' wages is actually no small amount, far more than $10. And if one figures roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of your average annual salary, it might actually be more than the several $1,000s that the NLT says. So the servants did have a significant debt between them. But then that debt is compared to the 10,000 talents. A talent in Roman days was 6,000 days of work. 10,000 of those means 60 million days. That's nearly 200,000 years of salary. That's far beyond the 100,000 or millions of dollars. These are large amounts, but what is being communicated here, the nuance, is an impossibly large amount. So much so that even though the other servant owing him 100 days worth of wages is a legitimate offense, it's nothing compared to what had been forgiven, and therefore he ought to have been able to forgive his fellow slave. So the NASB and other versions likely put those amounts so you can discover this. They'll put it in a footnote. Mine does. And then they leave it up to the reader to discover the meaning of the passage rather than try to tell you up front. In this example, the NLT reader might have missed the nuance of the message of forgiveness, at least to the degree. So even though the NASB is not as easy to read, it's more accurate. And though the NLT is easy to read, it might miss certain nuance. What do I recommend? Both. Both! Here's the chart again. It's got most of the more common versions of the Bible and where they fall along the spectrum of word for word and thought for thought. Since we have the internet, phone apps, and honestly, there's probably not much keeping you from owning multiple copies of physical Bibles, why not benefit from the strengths of each? What I do is I have a New American Standard for study and for teaching, and a New Living Translation for casual reading, for getting the big picture of a passage, for sharing it with others who are less familiar with the Bible. If word for word is a detailed painting of a tree and thought for thought is a painting of a forest, I want to have a whole forest of very detailed trees. Why not use each for their strengths and benefit from both? Now, over the coming weeks, we're going to keep talking about the Bible itself. We're going to talk about how it's structured and how to read it and how we got the books of the Bible and why we don't have other books in it. And also, of course, we're going to talk about those manuscripts. We're going to talk about how we got them and how we can trust them and how reliable they are. And if you want to have more videos like this one, don't forget to like and to subscribe. And if you want to support what I'm doing, I'll have a link to Patreon below that you can check out too. I'll see you next week, and God bless.